Sergeant Marshall believed he was detaining just another cocky black man. Little did he know, within hours, his career would crumble, his name would be on everyone's lips, and the entire nation would be watching. Why? Because the man he'd handcuffed wasn't just any motorist. He had arrested none other than the Attorney General. What followed stunned even the most seasoned professionals. But to truly understand, we have to rewind to where it all began. Sergeant Dan Marshall leaned back in his patrol car, stretching his legs and stifling a yawn. The night was dragging, the quiet, empty road stretched endlessly ahead, and the monotony was starting to gnaw at him. He craved some action, a little excitement to break the tedium. As if on cue, his eyes caught a sleek black sedan cruising down the road. It wasn't speeding recklessly, but just enough to catch his attention. The driver, a black man dressed sharply in a tailored suit, exuded confidence, a confidence Marshall couldn't stand. "Gotcha," Marshall muttered under his breath as he flipped on his lights. The sedan pulled over almost immediately, its movements calm and deliberate, much like its driver. As Marshall approached, the man behind the wheel didn't show a hint of anxiety. If anything, his composure irritated Marshall. He tapped on the window, his voice clipped. "License and registration," he demanded. Without a word, the man handed over his documents. His calm demeanor was unnerving. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his tone steady and polite. "You were speeding," Marshall lied, his eyes narrowing. The driver raised a skeptical eyebrow. "I was going 35 in a 40 zone," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. That tone, Marshall despised it. It was the voice of someone who didn't fear him, someone who thought they were his equal. He shot a glance inside the car. Spotless. No contraband, no weapons, nothing suspicious. Frustrated, Marshall's lip curled. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked. "On what grounds?" the man asked calmly. Marshall's hand moved to his cuffs. "Don't make me use force," he threatened. The man, still composed, stepped out and placed his hands on the hood. "You're making a mistake, officer," he said evenly. "Oh, I decide what's a mistake," Marshall shot back, gripping the man's arm and snapping the cuffs on with unnecessary force. "You're under arrest for resisting." The man didn't resist, but something about his steady gaze unsettled Marshall. It wasn't fearful or defiant, it was calculating. "You'll regret this," the man said softly. Marshall chuckled, dismissing the words. He couldn't have known how prophetic they would turn out to be. At the station, Marshall strutted down the corridor, leading the man into an interrogation room. He loved this part, the moment detainees realized the gravity of their situation. "Take a seat, boss," he said mockingly, shoving the man onto the hard chair. The man sat upright, calm as ever, arms crossed. There was no yelling, no pleading, just an unnerving stillness. His eyes, though, betrayed a sharp intellect at work, as if he were silently calculating his next move. "Name?" Marshall asked lazily as he began filling out the report. "Derek Williams," the man replied. Marshall paused for a split second. The name tickled the edges of his memory, but he brushed it off. "You think you're special, don't you?" "Fancy suit, calm attitude. Doesn't impress me," Marshall sneered. Derek's faint smirk returned, and his silence gnawed at Marshall's nerves. Used to outbursts, protests, or desperate pleas, this quiet confidence was unnerving. "All right, Mr. Big Shot," Marshall scoffed and walked to the duty desk, tossing the paperwork to Officer Johnson. Johnson started typing the information into the system, but his fingers froze mid-keystroke. His face went pale, his eyes wide as if he'd seen a ghost. "Dan," he whispered urgently, "you just arrested the state attorney general." A cold knot formed in Marshall's stomach. "You're kidding," he said, his voice wavering. Wordlessly, Johnson turned the computer screen. There it was, Derek Williams' official government photo, complete with his title in bold letters, State Attorney General. Marshall's mouth went dry, his palms slick with sweat. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Johnson hissed. "That man oversees every cop in this state. He fights corruption and abuse of power, and you just arrested him, on a bogus charge." Marshall's knees felt weak. He swallowed hard, hoping against hope. Maybe he'll let it slide. "Are you insane?" Johnson shot back. "Look at who you're dealing with." As Marshall turned toward the precinct's front window, an icy chill ran down his spine. A swarm of journalists had gathered, cameras flashing and microphones jostling for position. The chaos outside was deafening, and it was clear the scandal had already spiraled out of control. The interrogation room door creaked open, and Derek Williams emerged, flanked by the precinct chief and the lieutenant. His calm, authoritative demeanor commanded the room. "Officer Marshall," Derek began, his voice steady but edged with unyielding resolve. "I suggest you find yourself a competent lawyer." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pristine business card, and placed it on the desk in front of a stunned Marshall. Then, leaning in slightly, he added with a piercing gaze, "Oh, and I will most certainly be present at your hearing." Marshall stood frozen, unable to muster even a weak response, as Derek walked out of the precinct with measured poise. The instant he stepped outside, the mob of reporters erupted. Cameras flashed incessantly, and voices clashed in a cacophony of questions. Marshall knew, without a doubt, that his career had just been obliterated. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom buzzed with an almost electric tension. Every seat was occupied, journalists with their notepads, spectators whispering eagerly, and cameras poised to capture the trial of the year. It was hard to fathom, a state attorney general unlawfully detained by a patrol officer. Sergeant Dan Marshall sat at the defense table, his face a mask of forced composure. His lawyer's reassurances that this was a mere formality rang hollow in his ears. Deep down, he could feel the weight of what was coming. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and in walked Derek Williams. His tailored suit was impeccable, and his movements were deliberate, commanding the room's attention. A hush fell over the crowd as he made his way to the prosecution's table, exuding an air of quiet authority. Marshall shifted uneasily in his seat, his jaw tightening as Derek's eyes locked onto his. There was no anger in Derek's gaze, just an icy calculation that unnerved him to his core. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the judge entered the room. "This court is now in session for the case of the unlawful arrest of State Attorney General Derek Williams by Sergeant Daniel Marshall," the judge announced. Marshall swallowed hard, his palms slick with sweat. Derek rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm and clear, "I request that this trial be entirely public and transparent. Let the people witness the system in action." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The first piece of evidence played on the courtroom screen, the arrest video. It captured every damning detail, Marshall demanding Derek exit the vehicle without cause, snapping on handcuffs and issuing false charges. Gasps rippled through the audience, and murmurs filled the air as the footage unfolded. Derek turned to face Marshall. "Sergeant, you claimed I resisted arrest. Do you see any resistance in this footage?" Marshall's throat tightened. "Well, not exactly," he stammered. "So, you fabricated the charges?" Derek pressed, his gaze never wavering. "I was just doing my job," Marshall blurted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. The judge's gavel banged sharply. "Order in the court." Derek's voice remained steady, almost clinical. "This isn't just about one officer's misconduct. It's about a system that has shielded abuse for far too long. Today, this courtroom represents more than just one case. It's a stand against injustice." Marshall's fists clenched beneath the table, but he said nothing. An hour later, the judge delivered the verdict. "Sergeant Daniel Marshall, you are hereby suspended from duty. Additionally, a criminal case for abuse of power will be opened against you." Marshall felt the world tilt beneath him. His career, his authority, everything he had built, it was gone in an instant. Without sparing him a glance, Derek stood and left the courtroom, the murmurs of the crowd following him like an echo. A rapid fall from grace. 2 weeks had passed since the trial, and Marshall sat in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of the TV casting long shadows on the walls. Smoke from his cigarette curled lazily in the air as the news anchor's voice droned on. "Police scandal, racist arrest of the Attorney General," the anchor announced. On the screen, Marshall's mugshot appeared beside Derek Williams' poised and confident image. "Damn it," Marshall muttered, reaching for a bottle of whiskey. He had once believed the system would protect him, but now that the spotlight was on his actions, everyone had turned their backs. The next day, his worst fears were confirmed. His badge no longer granted him entry to the station. "Sergeant, you're suspended," the receptionist informed him, avoiding his eyes. "This is politics," Marshall snapped. "I was just following orders." "They want you at headquarters," she said softly. At headquarters, the commissioner and a team of lawyers awaited him. "Sergeant Marshall," the commissioner began, his tone grim, "you're under internal investigation." Marshall's jaw tightened. "Because of that damn Williams?" The commissioner sighed. "Not just him. We've reviewed your past cases, complaints, violations, video evidence. You've drawn too much attention. We can't protect you anymore. You're throwing me away." Marshall spat. "You've become a liability. The department needs a fresh start." A week later, the charges were filed: excessive force, false reporting, and systemic discrimination. The final verdict. The courtroom was packed for the final trial. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting Marshall's downfall to the nation. Daniel Marshall, the judge declared, "This court finds you guilty on all counts. You are permanently barred from law enforcement and sentenced to 3 years of probation." The murmurs in the crowd swelled. Some clapped, others whispered. Marshall sat motionless, his fists clenched. The man he had wronged, Derek Williams, watched silently from across the room. There was no triumph in his expression, just a calm, unshakable sense of justice. In the hallway, their paths crossed one last time. "Happy now?" Marshall growled. Derek adjusted his cuffs. "Justice has prevailed, Sergeant." He leaned in closer, his voice a chilling whisper. "The system didn't betray you. It just stopped protecting you." With that, Derek walked away, leaving Marshall alone with his shattered illusions. Outside, reporters cheered the victory of justice, but for Marshall, it was the sound of his world collapsing.